Welcome to another episode of What's at Stake, a Pinta podcast. I'm your host, Elliot Owensby. I'm managing director at Pinta, and I'm here in DC with Oliver Edelman, a director at the firm. Welcome, Oliver.
Hey, Elliot. Good to see you in person.
So I thought we'd take a little deep dive today into the latest in digital currency and the future of payments. Over 100 countries around the world are now exploring some version of a central bank digital currency, a CBDC, of course. And, you know, by my last count, there's something like 200 globally distributed stablecoins, the vast majority of which are backed by the US dollar. And yesterday you were at an event from the Atlantic Council kind of exploring all these themes on the evaluating, you know, what are the challenges around these developments? How do we move forward? How do we build international standards? And, you know, really bringing together some international policymakers with industry groups and stakeholders to kind of level set on, well, what are the key technologies? What are the policy considerations really in evaluating a CBDC or in building and proposing a CBDC? And I thought we'd just take a little time to hear some of your takeaways and kind of explore some of those themes.
Yeah, glad to be here.
So I guess high level, you know, let's just start. What's your take on where crypto, digital currency, digital payments, what's your take on where that stands today and kind of some of the macro trends or changes we may see? And then I want to dig in a little bit on how the event yesterday itself starts to kind of play some of those out.
Sure. So I think it's pretty clear that over the past 2-3 years or so, crypto, if we talk about crypto, there's a lot of flashy tabloid headlines, FTX, SBF, CZ.
I haven't heard of any. Are you sure?
I think what some people don't realize is that under the surface of all that, there was a lot of real work being done. Yeah. There was a lot of infrastructure being built. There were central banks, lawyers, engineers involved, building, thinking about what are the benefits of tokenization, of this distributed ledger technology, and how can we actually use these in a responsible way. And so, you know, the crazy headline phase is hopefully partially behind us. And yet the enduring technology and the work that has been done under the surface endures. And so one of my takeaways from the conference yesterday is that we are at the precipice of the tokenization of real world assets and of assets such as bonds. One of the breaking news, if you will, is that the World Bank is tokenizing promissory notes, which is essentially the way that it facilitates donations to developing countries. So that is now being tokenized in a pilot program. And so, you know, the question as it relates to money is, if we have financial assets that are being tokenized, we need a form of money that corresponds to that. Certainly there are stable coins and others. And the question is, what does that ecosystem look like? And I think it's pretty exciting. It's
funny to me that after all the years, plural, I mean, at least 3 or 4, around sort of like the Twitter meme of like blockchain solves that, or like that's what crypto can solve.
Yeah.
You know, now as sort of that some of that froth subsides, you see, no, that actually is what blockchain can solve.
Yeah, exactly.
Like that actually is. And I think net that's a positive thing. Right. I think no doubt that some of these processes, I mean, to take like multilateral or to take the World Bank as one example, that's pretty old structure. It's a pretty traditional structure. Mm-hmm. And I think that, you know, where you can facilitate some of that transparency using open ledger, distributed ledger, using, you know, however you think about the sort of mechanics to your point of the actual products and tools themselves, I think where you can add in that transparency and a little bit of that like broader functionality, I think that's a huge win for everybody involved.
Yeah, I agree. I think to your point, I think a lot of the talking points that we heard yesterday were things that you might have heard in 2017, 2018.
Right.
You know, atomized settlement, you know, no counterparty risk, these things that, you know, we've known about blockchain the whole time.
Right.
So, you know, it was not maybe as exciting as the like foam party crypto conferences of 2 years ago. There was no DJ Khaled.
No foam yesterday.
No foam yesterday. Paul Ryan was there though. So that was cool. But yeah, I think that doesn't mean that there aren't major challenges. And that was one of the objectives of the conference, was to say, you know, there's all this innovation happening. The banks are involved. The central banks are involved. There are pilots all over the world, private sector, central bank sponsored. And a problem, or a potential problem, is that we fracture the payment system globally. And we kind of have that now. So part of the problem that blockchain solves, right, is in theory, up until now, we've been living in a world where the financial system works off of individual messages between banks. It's almost, there's an example that someone gave yesterday of like, we have been living in a one-off email world and we are now moving to group chat world. And, you know, it's like, how is it easier to plan a party, through one-off emails or through a group chat? Obviously through a group chat. Everybody knows what's going on at the same time. That's kind of what blockchain is. And the problem is though, is if we're creating a new financial, in a way, creating a new financial infrastructure, we don't want to be creating multiple group chats. We want one mega group chat, right? We don't want to kind of be creating the same problem over again. And so we need to achieve interoperability both from an engineering perspective, so through open source technology, and then also from a governance perspective. And that's specifically through cybersecurity standards, through privacy standards. Certainly there are questions around China's CBDC and all of these things. And that's what the folks at the Atlantic Council are working on today.
And I would say too, like interoperability to me is one of those things that I think you have to give a lot of credit, and you have to be fair to a lot of the crypto firms and builders that have been working on, something as sort of fundamental as like a cross-chain bridge for a long time. That to me is another of those like enduring impacts of the last couple of years. Is a lot of the firms started to work and encourage developers to work across chain. Mm-hmm. And in some regard, kind of blowing that up and scaling it to the level of, World Bank interoperability certainly comes with challenges and opportunities. But I think it is important to recognize that in some way stands on the back of a lot of the work that's already been done by the kind of native and passionate crypto community, right?
Yeah, exactly. That's 100% true. I will say that a challenge now that the ecosystem is facing is that there's not one entity that is building this, right? It's not like the World Bank has expertise in building blockchains, nor does it want to, nor does the IMF and so forth. They can guide and they provide expertise and so forth, especially on governance. And now it's really a multi-stakeholder effort to come to agreement on these things, which is challenging, which is why there's this worry around fracturing.
You touched on governance, and I'd love to hear, kind of the upshot out of the discussion yesterday in your eyes, and how, again, I think you have to be cognizant that the level of, I guess I'm just going to say, the level of centralization that a central bank has to undertake, it can be a little bit at odds with where a lot of the crypto and even some of the broader like payments infrastructures and innovation is today. You raise the right point that you don't want to have splintering or firms necessarily working at cross purposes given the consequences of global payments, right? But I think, I'd love to hear more about how governance came up yesterday and how kind of some of these proposals are for how we would manage a truly global or synchronized payments process.
So in individual conversations, it was my takeaway that the most realistic next step among participants is something called the Regulated Liability Network, which is an initiative run by a few different banks that was piloted by a few different banks under the auspices of the New York Fed. And so what this essentially looks like is it does not require a change in law, but it is rather just an infrastructure upgrade to the way that the current financial system works. Mm-hmm. The difference would be that transactions are settled in wholesale CBDC, which we do not obviously have yet. But the advantage is that there is no legal change that needs to happen. And specifically, there was someone from Citi that mentioned, I guess I had never really thought about this before, that regulated financial institutions cannot pay gas fees on Ethereum, for example, because it does not comply with third-party risk management. That is to say, there may be sanctioned entities that they would be paying gas fees to. And so regulated financial institutions cannot currently engage in an open permissionless blockchain. It has to be permission blockchain. And the Regulated Liability Network is an example of that, an initiative. And so that's something that, some folks see as the next step in this. It would obviously require banks to take the next step, and it would require, as the pilot had indicated, a wholesale US CBDC. And we'll see if that happens.
You mentioned tokenization and some of the broader trends towards, I think in some ways this has been the holy grail in some, the bond market being a good example where, whatever you can do to facilitate better price efficiency, better kind of transparency on market mechanics is generally all positive, and there's lots of room to improve. How did kind of this real world tokenization come up yesterday, and what are the sort of most promising green shoots on that front?
Yeah, so I mentioned the example of the World Bank and promissory notes that was unveiled yesterday. There was discussion around, specifically in Asia, around, Asia is interesting from a payments perspective, to be specific, because many Asian countries essentially jumped over credit cards, for example, and are now straight, there was an example made of consumers don't even really interact with their bank anymore. It's all done through third-party platforms, through Grab and WeChat and these things. So Asia being, generally more advanced than we are, here in the United States is at the precipice, apparently, of tokenization of real world assets. That is to say, Asian consumers interact every day with fintechs in a way that we in the U.S. maybe don't as much yet. And so the acceptance of tokenized financial assets is in terms of consumer behavior, in terms of bank acceptance, in terms of just the infrastructure that's going on there, much more advanced than it is here. And so there are examples there. There are other World Bank pilots. I think I might be wrong. I think Australia and the World Bank worked together on a pilot tokenizing government securities, government bonds. And so, I think the cat is out of the bag and this stuff is going to happen. There are obviously the technical benefits that we've talked about earlier. And now it's just the question of what is the best money that matches the tokenization of those assets. Mm-hmm. And so the question is, is it stable coins? Is it CBDC? Is it tokenized deposits, which is, another kind of piece of this ecosystem? And we did have central banks there that certainly have concerns around, in an increasingly digital world, maintaining the singleness of money. Parna and I talked earlier today about when the last time is we used cash. I only use cash at my hairdresser because she does not accept she's great, but she does not accept credit cards. Other than that, my main interface with money is the private money, right? It's my Bank of America money, Amex money, what have you. And so if you abstract money away from that central bank currency, or from the central bank, the core central bank money, how do you maintain singleness? And this is something that central banks are concerned about. Maintaining that faith in the currency is a big reason why they are exploring, and I don't want to say endorsing, but exploring CBDC.
You, and just to break the fourth wall here for a second, Aparna is our producer who we couldn't put on the pod without. You mentioned an interesting point on consumer behaviors, and you and I were talking earlier about something as sort of today, as fundamental and as widely accepted as like Apple Pay, mm-hmm. right? Like I don't think many consumers would call that a quote unquote digital payment in the same way that gets sort of discussed at these think tank events or these discussions with policymakers, right? So in your view, do you think it's most likely that ultimately it is just, that tokenization, to butcher the phrase, happens slowly and then all at once, like that as these innovations proceed and as certainly we'll need the protections and regulations in place to make sure good actors can succeed, that one day you'll just be using some of these tokenized assets without even necessarily having to do the financial or mental gymnastics mm-hmm. to make it happen?
I think it depends, and it depends on a few different things.
It always depends.
It always depends. I think one, it depends on the country in question.
Yeah.
I think one of the really cool things about payments is how different payments are in different countries. Like you think it's like the same thing everywhere. It's not. And I think in the US, we are so accustomed to the concept of being paid for paying, as in like I deserve air miles because I paid for my sandwich, right? It's like ingrained. And if mm-hmm. you don't, it's like you're losing something. Mm-hmm. I think that same feeling is not ubiquitous around the world. And I think that, folks in Asia who 20 years ago were paying in cash and now are paying in WeChat don't have that same feeling, mm-hmm. right? And so they may have a different level of acceptance when it comes to moving to stablecoin payments or something else, right? I also think it depends on the consumer versus enterprise level. So, banks, they will see enormous savings if they tokenize these various one-off messages that they're currently doing mm-hmm. and create a shared ledger amongst themselves mm-hmm. where ownership is proven and, you don't have to reconcile these various ledgers and have this whole back-end situation going on. And so I think uptake can happen very quickly at the enterprise level, and it can happen very quickly outside of the U.S. And I think inside of the U.S., it kind of depends.
All right. Here's the close.
All right.
In what year will you, me, and Aparna have a, knowingly or not, fully tokenized payment tool that I'm tapping or waving at the grocery store?
That's a good question. Depends on what your definition of token on a blockchain. That's it. Yeah. Well, because token, your Apple Pay is technically a token, but it's not a blockchain token. That's a good question. There were a few of these future predictions at this conference, as you can imagine. So one of the things I was surprised about is that I think of a panel of three. Two of three said by 2030, most democratic countries will have launched a retail CBDC. Yeah, which is surprising. When will we be paying with tokenized money? I think in the United States, and I really think that the air miles are that important. I think it will be possible by 2030. I think I want my Amex points still in 2030. So if they can tokenize that somehow, sure. But until then,
I love it. For the record, me too. All right. Well, let's tell you what. Let's get back and do a pod in 2030 and we can evaluate the predictions.
Looking forward to it.
All right.
Thanks, Elliot.
Oliver, thanks for joining me today for our mini deep dive. To our listeners, remember to like and subscribe wherever you listen to your podcasts and follow us on Twitter at PintaGRP. I'm your host, Elliot Owensby, and as always, thank you for listening to What's at Stake.